Have you ever asked yourself what it truly meant to live behind the golden gates of the palace? Not as royalty, but as a prisoner draped in silk? Imagine walking through the gleaming halls of Topkapi Palace in the 16th century. The air is thick with the scent of rosewater and oud. The corridors echo with soft footsteps, and the sound of zither hum faintly in the distance. You might think this was paradise, but for the boys who served in its deepest chambers, it was anything but. These were not heirs or noble sons. They were children taken, ripped from villages in Africa, the Balkans, the Caucasus. They were sold, bought, and brutally altered, stripped of their manhood through a horrifying process of castration. They were remade into tools of empire, and then they were placed in service to the Sultan, not as free men, but as voiceless watchers of the harem, as male concubines who were neither fully men nor fully slaves. What could possibly justify such cruelty? And why did the Ottoman elite consider this practice not just necessary, but normal? These boys, some as young as 8, were seen as ideal servants, unable to procreate, emotionally neutral, and physically present, yet culturally invisible. They moved like ghosts through the marble halls, serving the Sultan's women, guarding secrets, executing orders with precision of a blade. And yet, in their silence, they began to accumulate something unexpected: power. Over time, some of these eunuchs rose in the ranks, commanding more influence than the generals or viziers who had mocked them. They could sway royal decisions, determine which child might be named heir, and sometimes even whisper death into the Sultan's ear. But at what cost? They lived without families, without legacy, and most devastating of all, without identity. Their pasts were erased, their futures predetermined. Many died young. The lucky ones lived long enough to forget the sound of their own name. This is not a story told in history classes. It is not carved into statues or sung in triumph. It is a tale buried in the shadows of empire, of boys turned into flesh-bound keys for political control. And yet, despite their suffering, they endured. Some adapted, some resisted, some even ruled. This episode uncovers the lost world of the Ottoman male concubines, the pain they bore, the secrets they kept, and the unimaginable system that turned broken boys into the silent architects of empire. What would you have done if stripped of everything human and offered only one path forward, obedience or death? Their silence shaped an empire. Now, their story will finally be heard. At the height of its power in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna. Its capital, Istanbul, shimmered like a jewel between east and west, a city of minarets, bazaars, and blood politics. The Sultan ruled as shadow and sun, seen only by the elite and feared by the world. Yet behind the walls of Topkapi Palace, beyond the courtyards, past the golden fountains and marble columns, lay a world few ever saw: the Imperial Harem. Most imagine it as a place of women, veiled and adorned in jewels, waiting for the Sultan's desire. But that image is only half true, because within that same silken prison were others, boys. Young, scared, and broken boys. They did not arrive by choice. They were not born into power. They were taken, by force, by money, by empire, and ushered into a life they could never escape. These boys came from across the empire's vast reaches: Ethiopia, Sudan, Greece, Albania, Georgia. Some were prisoners of war. Others were bought from desperate families. Many were simply stolen, dragged from their homes while too young to even understand why. Upon arrival, they were separated by type: the most handsome, the strongest, the most obedient. These boys were sent to different fates, but the cruelest were chosen for palace. There, they entered the world of the Enderun, the palace school for elite pages, and summoned to the ranks of the harem agalari, or black eunuchs. Before training even began, their manhood was stripped away in the most horrifying fashion, castrated, often without anesthesia, and left to survive or die. Only the strongest lived. These survivors were considered purified, their humanity exchanged for loyalty, their futures traded for silence. They were now the property of the Sultan, trained to serve not just with their hands, but with their entire being. Inside the harem, they became the gatekeepers of imperial intimacy. No man, not even the Sultan's most trusted viziers, could enter the private quarters of the royal women. Only the eunuchs, neither man nor fully servant, were allowed. They watched over the sultan's wives, concubines, sisters, and daughters. They carried messages, gifts, and sometimes secrets between chambers. They were both jailers and protectors, guardians and slaves. And in this brutal hierarchy, there was one law: speak only when spoken to, obey without hesitation, and never, ever look a woman in the eye. Imagine being taken at age 9, your native tongue silenced forever, your body mutilated, and your past erased. From that day forward, your name would not belong to you. You would exist in the margins of empire, in velvet shadows, wearing silence like armor. And yet, some of these boys would rise, not just to serve, but to rule in their own quiet, terrifying way. Before a boy could enter the walls of Topkapi Palace, before he could wear silk robes or speak in whispers beside the Sultan's chambers, he had to survive a transformation so brutal, so unnatural, that most never lived to tell the tale. The journey often began in the sun-scorched deserts of Sudan or the back alleys of Cairo. Captured or sold, the boys were lined up like livestock, inspected for strength and beauty. And then came the operation. Carried out not in sterile chambers, but in mud-brick courtyards or the dark corners of slave markets, the process was unspeakably cruel. No anesthesia, no mercy. A hot blade, a rag for the mouth, and the prayers of the lucky. Some were only partially castrated. Others had everything removed. In the moments that followed, the fate of each child hung by a thread. Literally, bleeding, broken, and delirious, they were wrapped in ashen bandages. For every 10 boys who entered that chamber, 8 would die from blood loss, infection, or shock. Yet those who survived were considered valuable, remade, refined, and purified in the eyes of their captors. And here lies the bitter irony. Islam, the faith of the very empire they were being molded to serve, forbade the practice of castration. It was written in law, recited in prayer. But empire has always known how to twist faith to suit its needs. The Ottomans employed a loophole. They claimed that since the procedure was not done by Muslims, it did not violate the faith. So instead, it was outsourced, delegated to Christian or pagan slavers far from the palace walls. A convenient hypocrisy that allowed the sultans to benefit from a system they claimed to condemn. The result was a caste of eunuchs, boys who had been physically mutilated to ensure loyalty, stripped of any sexual threat, and presented as ideal servants, unable to father children, incapable of betraying the royal bloodline, and legally outside of traditional male identity. They became the perfect tools of empire. But beneath the titles and the robes, they were still human, and the trauma ran deep. Many suffered lifelong infections, emotional instability, and chronic pain. Their voices, often high and ghostly, became a cruel reminder of the boyhood that was taken from them. Imagine being told that your worth was measured by what you no longer were, that your survival came not from courage or strength, but from your willingness to be broken, to serve the Sultan. These boys had to surrender everything that made them boys. No future, no family, no identity, just obedience. Silent, unquestioning, eternal. And yet they lived, bent, but not always broken. Over time, these survivors, these discarded souls, would rise through the ranks. They would master the art of courtly manipulation. They would become confidants, gatekeepers, and sometimes even puppet masters behind the veil of power. But they never forgot what it cost them. Their life began on a stone floor in the heat of foreign land, with the sound of water dripping and the gleam of a blade. History remembers the palace. It remembers the Sultan. But it rarely remembers the price that was paid to keep the empire clean, controlled, and quiet. Inside the imperial walls, the eunuchs were stripped not only of their manhood, but of their will. Their days began before sunrise and ended long after the palace had gone quiet. Trained from the moment they arrived, they were taught to walk without sound, speak only when spoken to, and anticipate every need of those they served. One wrong glance, one delay in obedience, and they would face swift and merciless punishment. Whips were not uncommon. Solitary confinement in stone chambers was routine. The younger ones were taught by the older eunuchs in a twisted form of mentorship, lessons in how to disappear within one's own skin. Their training was meant to erase all traces of boyhood, all flickers of rebellion. Even emotions became forbidden territory. Smiling without reason, crying in public, showing fear, all could result in punishment. The goal was singular, obedience so perfect, it became instinct. These were not lives lived freely but programmed, step by step, breath by breath, to serve in silence. Yet within that suffocating silence, a rigid hierarchy governed their existence. At the very top was a Kisler Agassi, the chief black eunuch. He wielded immense power, second only to the Grand Vizier and occasionally the Sultan himself. He controlled access to the harem, held the keys to the private chambers, and managed the education of future sultan sons. He could make or break careers, direct the flow of imperial gossip, and influence matters of succession. Yet his authority did not erase his origins. He too had once lain bleeding on a distant floor, a child carved by empire. Below him, a strict chain of command ensured that younger eunuchs dared not step out of line. They were grouped by seniority, their duties ranging from cleaning chamber pots to overseeing the harem's delicate rituals. Despite the grandeur of their setting, golden tiles, velvet curtains, silk cushions, their movements were heavily choreographed and constantly observed. A misstep, even in the silence of a hallway, could be their undoing. And always, the rules remained cruelly clear. Eunuchs were never to look a woman in the eye unless given explicit permission. They could not speak to them casually, touch them, or even be in the same room without clear orders. Yet, ironically, they were expected to watch every move the women made. They became the silent sentinels of imperial virtue, spying without questioning, guarding without bonding. Imagine standing day after day in dark corridors, hearing the soft laughter of concubines echo through stone walls, knowing you were close enough to see their lives, but forever barred from truly living one of your own. They were both jailers and prisoners, trusted with royal secrets, but never their own freedom. Their bodies had been taken, and now their identities were stripped layer by layer. They became shadows, ever present, never seen. And yet, in those shadows, power flickered. The very silence that imprisoned them would one day become their greatest weapon. In the gilded silence of Topkapi Palace, the harshest rule imposed on the eunuchs was not obedience. It was a denial of love, stripped of their bodies, forbidden to marry, and isolated from any emotional attachments. They were sentenced to a life of spiritual exile. To feel desire was seen as rebellion. To form a bond was considered a threat. And so, love, one of the most basic human needs, became a silent, unreachable ache. The palace was filled with hundreds of people. Yet for the eunuchs, it was the loneliest place on earth. They watched women laugh, children grow, and princes rise, but they themselves remained invisible. Permanent observers, never participants. Friendships were discouraged. Attachment was punished. And over time, their sense of self withered. They could not imagine a future because they had been denied a past. They had no families, no tribes, no roots. Just duty, just walls, just emptiness draped in velvet. The emotional toll was devastating. Many suffered from what today we would call depression, although no word existed for it in their world. Their condition was spoken of in whispers. Some grew silent and listless. Others became erratic or withdrawn. A few lost their minds completely, and some chose to end their suffering. Suicide was rare, but not unheard of. A handful of eunuchs threw themselves from towers, drowned in palace fountains, or drank poison smuggled in with laundry. Others attempted to escape the palace walls, knowing the punishment, if caught, would be far worse than death. Their cries were never written in royal histories, but fragments of their sorrow live on in old poetry, stray diary pages, and half-erased memories of foreign travelers who noticed them. One journal, hidden in the archives of a Venetian noble, record the words of a palace eunuch. I watch life as through glass. I serve, but I do not live. A simple sentence, but behind it a universe of pain, of longing for a life that was stolen before it even began. And yet, in that void, rare and fragile connections sometimes bloomed. Some eunuchs formed quiet friendships with each other, small, unspoken alliances of shared suffering. A knowing glance across the chamber, a shared loaf of bread, a whisper exchanged in the dark. Occasionally, a deeper bond would form between a eunuch and one of the harem women. These were not romantic in a conventional sense, but something softer. Two exiles finding comfort in each other's pain. A concubine, trapped by politics and expectation. A eunuch, bound by mutilation and duty. Their conversations were brief, their meetings discreet, but they offered something rare, a sense of being seen, of being understood. And while these moments did not erase the grief, they brought flickers of light into an otherwise unending night. In a world designed to erase their humanity, those glimmers of connection were nothing short of rebellion. For those eunuchs who survived the agony of castration, the suffocating discipline of palace life, and the soul-crushing loneliness of servitude, there remained one more realm to master: power. The Ottoman palace was a nest of secrets, an empire within an empire where whispers could topple viziers and favors could alter the line of succession. And in this hidden world, the eunuchs became far more than servants. They became the eyes and ears of the sultan, trusted more than any general, more than any blood relative. Why? Because they had nothing to gain from legacy or lineage. They could never start dynasties, raise armies of their own, or father sons who might someday threaten the throne. Their loyalty was born of necessity and pain. As a result, some eunuchs rose to incredible heights. The Kisler Agassi, or chief black eunuch, became one of the most powerful figures in the Ottoman court. He controlled access to the sultan's private chambers. He mediated messages between royal wives and foreign powers. And he oversaw the Imperial Harem, the very heart of palace intrigue. But with power came danger. The higher a eunuch climbed, the more enemies he made. Court life was a chessboard of shifting alliances and secret rivalries, and eunuchs often became kingmakers and executioners alike. With one word, a eunuch could have a concubine exiled, a prince disinherited, or a vizier disgraced. Some even manipulated imperial succession, ensuring the rise of more favorable heir or the fall of one they despised. Bishir Aga, one of the most famous chief eunuchs of the 18th century, ruled the palace with such authority that foreign diplomats feared crossing him. And yet, he had no army, no title beyond the harem. His power lived in shadows, in the manipulation of proximity, in the secrets he carried behind sealed lips. Betrayal became a currency, blackmail a tool, silence a weapon, while they had no voice in public. Within the walls of Topkapi, their every whisper could reshape history. In the empire's most secretive domain, eunuchs were both protectors and predators. Still, their rise was always precarious. Their power was conditional, entirely dependent on the sultan's favor. One misstep, one shift in court winds, and they could fall as quickly as they rose. Some were poisoned, others exiled or quietly executed. And when a sultan died, so too did the fortunes of his most trusted eunuch. The same man who had controlled the fates of princes could find himself shackled and dragged from the palace in a single night. It was a life lived on a razor's edge, where the cost of survival was constant calculation, and the price of failure was silence forever. And yet, the fact remains, the most mutilated, marginalized men in the Ottoman Empire once ruled its most sacred spaces. They transformed their suffering into strategy, their exclusion into dominance, not by brute force, but by mastering the art of being indispensable. They were ghosts in silk, unseen, unheard, and yet impossibly powerful. No empire lasts forever, and even the shadows must one day retreat into the light. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was crumbling under the weight of modernity and internal decay. Western powers circled like vultures, demanding reform and accountability. The world was changing, faster than the palace could hide. The Imperial Harem, once the heart of Ottoman politics and secrecy, began to lose its influence. And with it, so too did the eunuchs. The whispers that once held the power to crown or destroy now echoed through empty halls. Reformist sultans, beginning with Mahmud II, sought to modernize the state. That meant stripping away centuries of tradition, including the eunuch system. The practice of castration, already controversial even by Ottoman standards, became harder to justify. The harem's power shrank. Eunuchs were reassigned, removed, or simply forgotten. Their role, once vital to the empire's machinery, became obsolete in the age of bureaucracy and Western diplomacy. By the time the Ottoman Empire officially collapsed in the early 20th century, the eunuchs had all but disappeared. Many were dismissed quietly. Others stayed on as relics, keepers of keys that no longer open anything. The harem itself was dismantled in 1909, and the last eunuchs either died in obscurity or wandered to the decaying remnant of a palace that no longer needed them. Some returned to the streets of Istanbul, unrecognizable without their silk robes and formal titles. Others lived out their final years in service to minor officials or religious institutions, carrying themselves with a discipline that had been beaten into them from childhood. But most left no record, no graves with names, no family to remember them, just silence. The empire had used them, used their bodies, their pain, their loyalty, and when it no longer had use for them, it cast them aside like broken tools. The same halls that had once trembled at their approach now stood cold and indifferent. And so, the eunuchs vanished, not in fire or revolt, but in silence. The silence they had been trained to perfect their entire lives. History did not celebrate their passing. No monuments were raised. No prayers were offered. The very system that had elevated them to heights of influence refused to acknowledge the price they had paid. Today, only faint traces remain. Rusted keys, faded records, blurred paintings, and the occasional traveler's tale. But if you walk the quiet corridors of Topkapi Palace, you may still feel their presence, in the way the light fades at dusk, in the stillness of locked doors, in the knowledge that behind every golden empire are the forgotten hands that held it up, bloodied, silenced, and now gone. What can we learn from the lives of the eunuchs, the boys who were mutilated into obedience, the men who lived in shadows, and the ghosts who once held the keys to an empire? Their story is more than a tragedy. It is a reminder of how power can dehumanize, how entire systems, no matter how magnificent or refined, can be built on the backs of suffering. These eunuchs were seen not as people, but as functions, guards, servants, tools. The empire admired their silence, not their strength. It trusted their loyalty because it had severed all other bonds. And yet, despite the horror they endured, many found ways to adapt. Some rose to power. Others carved out quiet dignities in a world that gave them none. Their story reminds us that history is not just shaped by emperors and generals, but also by the invisible, the silenced, the broken who found ways to survive. Today, their legacy lingers not in monuments or names, but in the questions they leave behind. How many voices are missing from our histories because they were never allowed to speak? How many lives were shaped by systems that erased their identity in exchange for order? The eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire lived and died in service to greatness that refused to recognize their own. But their silence was not empty. It was filled with strength, sacrifice, and a yearning for something more. In remembering them, we honor every person who has ever been forced to surrender their selfhood just to be allowed to exist. Their story is not simply about pain. It's about resilience. It's about the cost of empire. And it's about how, even in the most gilded cages, the human spirit finds ways to endure. Now that you walked through the shadows of Topkapi Palace, stood in silence with the forgotten and heard the story the empire tried to bury, what will you do with it? The eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire were once everywhere, and yet nowhere. They shaped dynasties, carried royal secrets, and held power in hands that had once been bound in chains. Their pain built palaces. Their silence preserved crowns. And yet, they were never allowed to be remembered as men, only as roles, as relics. But now, their story is returned, not through gold inscriptions or imperial decrees, but through you, the listener, the witness. If this story moved you, if it made you question what's been erased from history, help us make sure it's never forgotten again. Subscribe to this channel for more untold stories from the ancient world. Share this video to let others hear the silence behind the empire. And comment below, should the eunuchs of Topkapi be honored as survivors or mourned as victims? Their story is not just history. It's a mirror, one that forces us to ask, in every empire, who suffers so that others may rule? Thank you for watching and for remembering.